My name is Alison Choi. I'm 23 years old and I was born in Hong Kong. So my dad's job took him there and he worked in finance. So eventually my mom joined him. Me and my sisters, we were all born in Hong Kong, but I didn't move here permanently until college. And that was in 2015. And yeah, now I work here as well. My parents grew up in the States. My mom's family moved initially to California and then to Memphis, and that's where she grew up, just in Memphis in the South. And then my dad moved initially to American Samoa, but eventually he grew up in St. Louis, so his whole family kind of went to St. Louis. That was where his relatives were as well. So they're much more American than me. They grew up there, went to school in the States. Yeah, and so me coming here for school just to me made sense because of my American identity, I guess. In terms of my Korean American identity and growing up in Hong Kong, I feel like just as children, we come to that realization as we gain experience. And I guess honestly, I knew that I was American, like that was at the forefront of my like self-knowledge. The Korean part maybe was the unspoken part that I knew. But it was confusing because all the other Americans that I knew in Hong Kong were white Americans or even Chinese Americans, but pretty much mainly white Americans. I was in a very privileged position as like what would be termed an expat, which is really an immigrant. And I wouldn't say I knew a lot of, I guess, American people of color who were living abroad. And so that was confusing because I knew I was different than the other Americans. If I think about myself as a kid, there was just this like nebulous cloud of like, I'm Asian, but I'm American. And I really didn't like the Asian part because I didn't understand being American and Asian at the same time. If I ever thought about being Korean, I was very upset because I just didn't, it was cool. It was cool to be American. But if you're a Korean American, that like it doesn't make sense. Because you have to be one or the other. I mean, there's a term called like third culture kid, and I think that was the first time I really thought, oh, that maybe that could be me. Honestly, now I'm not so sure, but I was like, yeah, I'm like this mix of American and Korean culture and also Hong Kong culture, and that in itself creates a unique cultural identity. When I went to college is when I really was like, I think I need to confront my Asian American and my Korean American identity, not just like within myself though, like in relation to others, because I really didn't know a lot of American history. I didn't know what it was like to be around all these American peers rather than like Americans who lived abroad. That was a steep learning curve, but I like dove right into the deep end. I dove into like histories of different people. Like I studied African American history, Latinx history, American history in general. I mean, my priority was to learn about everyone but me because I didn't think that I could make an opinion about myself without knowing about others. College was rapid steps to realizing who I was and kind of unlearning like habits of thinking. Somehow I managed to like not just unlearn it, but like be totally comfortable in being Asian and like being proud to be among my community. And I think part of that process was even learning what community felt like because I didn't have a Korean American community or an Asian American community until maybe like 2 years ago. So yeah, I really had to like take that out of my imagination and be like, why that doesn't say anything about who I am. Because even still, like, I feel like as Korean Americans, as Asian Americans, we're reminded consistently of how we're stereotyped, from being called the name of whatever Asian girl is in your class to just being on guard in certain situations because of how we're created, like socially as this picture, as this role. And so I think once I learned about that intellectually, I was emotionally able to process it and I guess like mature in a sense. I kind of zeroed in on Asian American studies and Asian American history. And what I was really drawn to stories in that because I'm just like, wow, there are all these people with different experiences, but do they just poof out into the air? And also with language, like how do we overcome that in terms of creating a story that's accessible to all? I always gravitate towards personal projects, no matter if it's like in a professional setting or an academic setting or just in my life. I end up wanting to do something very vulnerable and personal. So I was like, I want to study family. It first started out with photography. I did a photographic project where I took a series of portraits of my grandma just sitting in her armchair. And that's when I realized, oh, like we're communicating, even though we're not talking. Like just taking photos of her was a way of communicating. And I think just starting to learn about my own history that I never knew was also like very empowering, I think. I was able to interview Korean elders who currently own or previously owned wig shops in African American areas. And that was like a very eye-opening experience, not just learning my own specific history, but all of their journeys. And also I visited the shops, so it was like an ethnography too, in terms of learning what the space was like and learning what Korean Black relationships are like face to face, because reading about it is great and it's one thing, but actually witnessing it is another. So it was a good way to bring in that part of my interests, taking photos of the store and interspersing it through my writing. One of the women I interviewed, she'd been doing that work since the late 60s and she's still working. Like she's working a lot less, but it was clearly like a part of their identity to be around the Black community and specifically Black women. I found that kind of noting those intimate interactions wasn't really in our popular cultural understanding or in academia. And so I was like, okay, I'm filling in some sort of space here, not just for myself, but perhaps for other people. Because I know there are lots of Korean Americans who could probably read that and be like, oh, my uncle did that, or my grandma did that too. But I wanted to see basically the nuances of Korean Black history when we get really intimate with it, in terms of how the shop owners themselves would describe their work and describe themselves. And some of it was really racist. And actually I found that gendered too. Like the men that I spoke to were probably spoke more abrasively, to say the least. But in the end, the women had much more interaction with Black people in general, just being in the store, styling the wigs, talking to women, not just about hair, but about like, how are your kids? Like, how's your job? Like that kind of intimate talk that can happen when they connect just by being both being mothers, for example. I would say right now I'm more like trying to figure out who I am and who I want to be. Now is the first time where I'm like, oh, I have a connection. Because even though I have a connection to my Korean culture and identity through my parents, they're very removed from any Korean American actual community, just being in Hong Kong and living their lives. And so somehow paths have crossed where I've met people who can actually be that authentic connection and know that I want to give as much as I'm learning. And so in terms of what I'm focusing on, it's really that, just like experiencing what it means to be a young Korean American purposefully, not just kind of existing in space. And it's a goal for me to learn who I can be when I fully acknowledge that part of myself. My name is Alison Choi, and this is my Korean American story.